This past Easter, my dad, a pilot for a cargo shipping company, was in town and offered to take me across the inlet for a nice dinner. As his co-pilots were always away from their families, they were also invited to join, and gladly they did. While I waited for them to validate their tickets at the ferry terminal, I spotted an unlikely duo standing by the door. Two guys, late 20s at most, one large and oafish, and the other shorter and movie star gorgeous. I looked just in time to see Oaf nod in my direction, and movie star make a face that can only be described as, I'd screw her after a few beers. They stood close to us in the terminal. Keep in mind, this ferry carries hundreds of people at a time, and I told my dad about the nod. He laughed and continued talking to his co-pilots next to us. Every time I looked over, movie star was already looking at me. I shook my head. We sat on opposite ends of the ferry, Oaf and movie star debarking before us. I was glad they were gone. We walked up the street from the terminal to the restaurant, and when I turned back to take in the view of the city across the water, was I surprised to find that the duo had somehow ended up behind us and were slowly walking up the street. I didn't think too much on it. It was a busy area and lots of pubs were around. I did think more about it when they walked by the restaurant, peering intently into the front window where we were standing waiting for a table. They smiled, exchanged words with each other, and kept moving. I let out a sigh of relief until they walked back by from the opposite direction. They stopped, leaned on a bike rack in front of the restaurant for a few minutes, and then left. Movie star was staring over his shoulder the whole time. Over dinner, I informed my dad and his co-pilots of the events that had transpired without them even realizing it. They laughed about it, and eventually they even had me laughing about it too. We had never seen the pair of guys again. But 3 hours later, as we waited for the return ferry, I was talking to our company, recounting a story from earlier at dinner, when I spotted Oaf and movie star over my dad's shoulder. Movie star was looking my way. Scratch that, staring my way. I quickly informed the guys. They were shocked and kept looking back at the pair. There was a miniature showdown in the ferry terminal as each party stared each other down from opposite ends. Long story short, I ended up getting a 3-man escort home that night. So if you're out there, Jensen Ackles and Shrek lookalikes, let's not meet again. When I was about 6 years old, Easter was rolling around and I really wanted a chocolate bunny. I asked my dad to take me to Rite Aid to get me one, and he said he was too busy, so I told him I would just walk, and he said that was fine because honestly, he was a pretty crappy parent. So I embark on the 1.5 or 2-mile walk through rural Louisiana to the store. Houses are pretty sparse. I come up to a 4-way intersection and I can see the store in the distance. As I approach the 4-way, I see a small green truck, which I think was a Ford Ranger. There are 2 men in it, and the one in the passenger seat is blatantly pointing at me repeatedly, and they're both looking at me. I was about to cross through a parking lot on the right side of this intersection when I see this truck whip into it and park between 2 other cars. Then, I see the passenger jump out of the truck and crouch down with his hands out, trying to hide between their truck and a vehicle that they had parked next to. Thankfully, an older woman that used to babysit me when I stayed with my mom filled my young head with a bunch of stranger danger propaganda, so I immediately flipped out, bypassed the parking lot, and broke out into a dead sprint into the Rite Aid. Once inside, I began to pace around the store a little bit to try to calm down. I took a glance through the glass front door, and I see this truck with the 2 guys in it parked right in front of the Rite Aid. At this point, I knew beyond all doubt what was going on. I asked the old lady at the cash register if I could use the store's phone to call my dad, and she said the phone could only be used to call 1-800 numbers for some reason. I burst into tears and started to get hysterical, and the manager came up to the front and let me use his cell phone. I got in touch with my dad, who sent my brothers to pick me up, and by the time they got there, the green truck had left. The worst part of all this? No one believed me. Everyone in my family just nonchalantly said, "So what happened? Something about a kidnapping?" And I told them what had happened, and everyone brushed it off. It was never spoken about again. It makes me furious to this day. I wonder what those scumbags were planning. And the thing that troubles me the most is that they could have gotten some other kid that day and done God knows what. So, wannabe kidnappers in the green truck? I hope you get buried alive. Let's not meet. I've read a lot of terrifying stories, but something happened to me when I was a child that scared me just as much. It's not as bad as some, but even now, over 20 years later, it still sticks with me. When I was around 10, my parents belonged to a local bowling team, and sometimes they'd take my siblings and I along to the bowling alley to go and watch. This particular night happened to be the night before Easter. My younger brother and I decided to grab a bowling ball and sit in the carpeted walkway and just roll it back and forth because we were bored. While we were doing that, a man approached and started talking to us. He seemed nice at first, just asking simple questions like, "How are you doing?" and "Are you excited for the Easter Bunny?" and "Are you gonna get lots of candy?" I didn't think anything of it, so I just politely answered his questions. Then, out of the blue, this guy whispers to me, "I know where you live. I'm like the Easter Bunny, but instead of candy, I'm gonna come into your house and kill you and your family." He then rambled on, basically repeating that over and over and over, and stuff about it being our last night to live. I just remember looking at the man speechless, and getting up, grabbing my brother, and going to find my parents. I didn't tell them what he said, and in hindsight I definitely should have. I was terrified all of Easter that year, because I was so scared that this man was actually going to come to our house and kill us. So, creepy man in the bowling alley? Let's never meet again. I had just gotten out of a really crappy relationship with a guy that I'd been living with for 3 years. He was a real pretty boy who looked like Johnny Depp, but he liked to steal all my money while I was at work and throw crazy parties. I got tired of his stealing and coming home to emo kids asleep all over my house, so I left him. I didn't want anything but my stuff, and I let him keep the house and the cars I bought him. Honestly, I just wanted my sanity back. I moved back in with my granny. I'm her favorite grandchild, and she spoiled me, as she does. I had recently connected with my best friend again that I had known since kindergarten, Chris. I was hanging out with Chris on my back porch one morning when the subject of the boys gets brought up. Chris is gay, and we often like to talk about boys together. He asked if I was seeing anybody, and I tell him that I'm not. It had only been a few months since I left the money leech, and I didn't think I was ready to trust anyone. Chris said he knew the perfect man for me. I said that I don't think there is such a thing, but he begs me to go meet this guy. I reluctantly sigh and tell my granny that I'm going on an adventure with Chris. We talked as we drove, and he tells me that this guy's been in love with me since we were kids. He told me it was this little boy Quinn that used to follow me around. I told him I thought Quinn was a lot younger than us. He told me that Quinn is just short, like me. He called Quinn and told me to talk to him. I do, and he seems really sweet but a little airheaded. We show up at his house, and he's really pretty. He was also very sweet, has a good job, has his own car, and owns his own company. Not bad. So we started hanging out a lot, and eventually we started dating. He buys me presents like nice jewelry and Prada sunglasses. He told me his girl only deserved the best, and I told him I couldn't accept all these gifts, but he would just dump them in my car or purse when I wasn't looking, so I learned to just take them. He wanted to always call me and talk for hours, and wanted me to call when I got home from his house. I thought he was sweet and just wanted to make sure I'd gotten home safely. The reality set in rather quickly. He introduced me to his entire family within a couple days of us dating. I usually don't introduce guys to my family until we're serious, but whatever. Upon meeting his mother, I learned that it's her house, and he lives there with her. I also learned that he has no job other than doing odd jobs for his dad. I was speechless. He also lied about being my age. I was 24, and apparently he had just turned 18 like the day or so before we started dating. I was so upset I didn't know how to feel. He begs me not to leave him and to take him to my play rehearsal the next day. So I agreed. He showed up in my driveway just as I was leaving for the theater. Chris drove me there and tells me we need to sort out our stuff, and he said if Quinn was gay, he'd be all over him and not to leave him over a few small lies. The whole drive is awkward. I don't want to talk to this guy. I want him gone. He pulls out a diamond ring and tries to propose to me. I tell him no, but he slides the rock on my finger anyway. He said I need to think about it. I go to the theater and things just go downhill from there. He embarrassed me in front of my friends with his ignorance and childishness and threw a total fit because my other friend, Mikey, gave me a piggyback ride. He stormed out, and then his mother started calling to check up on him. I decided I was done. After rehearsal, I got a friend to go with me to drive him home. I tried to give the ring back, but he wouldn't take it. I left and went to a bar with my fellow actors. I told him that was why I had to take him home so early. Driving back, I see flashing lights in my rearview mirror, and I hear yelling. Chris and Quinn are both following me. I pull into the bar, and Chris throws Quinn and myself at each other and just yells that we need to talk. We need to work this out. I break up with Quinn. As he starts throwing a fit, I walk into the bar with my friend. I spend the night at Mikey's for a few days, and when I return home, I have a ton of harassing phone calls. He called me, and he called my grandparents every few hours. He even had Chris help. Everywhere I went, he was there. He stalked me at home, made me run from a theater during a movie, and followed my car. And the worst part, Chris helped him do all this. And then came Easter. We were all outside during Easter, and Quinn came up and pulled a gun on my entire family. I was helping little kids hunt eggs. He cruised by several times and then pulled his gun out. He creeped by with his gun and pointed it at all of us. I filed a restraining order that day. I moved in with Mikey so he would leave my grandparents alone too. I went nowhere without at least 2 guys with me at all times. I thought for sure any minute he would come and kill me. I felt hunted like a deer in the woods. I was lucky. He shot up the car of his next girlfriend while her 2-year-old daughter was inside. I was real lucky. Quinn and Chris, let's never meet again. I'll start by saying that I've never been close with this particular uncle. He's not related to me by blood. He's married to my mom's sister. He's always kind of weirded me out in a sense because he's usually very drunk and constantly swearing. I don't have anything against swearing, but he does it too much, and it's just very off-putting. He also has a very red face. Now, I don't see this side of my family often because they live about 5 hours away. A thing like that can put a strain on familial relationships. So, my mom, my sister, my nephew, and I had driven to see them for Easter weekend when I was around 15 years old. I always have had issues with car sickness and had to take gravel, which has never failed to knock me out. When we got there, I was still pretty out of it and not really awake. I certainly wasn't in a talkative mood, so I went to lie down on the couch. As was, and still is, my habit, I curled up on the couch, really only taking up one cushion. The gravel was still making me drowsy, but I didn't completely fall asleep. I don't really know how to explain this sort of state, but I wasn't really awake and I wasn't entirely asleep. Anyway, at one point I felt someone sit down next to me, and I could hear that it was my uncle. He had said something in his unmistakable voice that made him sound like he was from Newfoundland, even though he's not. I didn't really think much of it. I mean, it was his house, right? He could sit where he wanted. Thinking about it now, though, it was a little odd because the couch had 3 cushions to seat 3 people. He made the decision to sit on the middle cushion closest to me, even though it certainly would have been more comfortable for both of us in terms of space for him to sit on the opposite end of the couch. Then, I felt a hand on my thigh. I wasn't awake enough to do anything about it. Maybe I was too afraid, I don't know. And his hand stayed there for a while. Everyone else was sitting outside on the deck, and it was only he and I that were in the living room. So naturally, no one else saw this. I'm not quite sure how long this lasted. When I was fully awake, he was gone. I told my mom, and she was instantly furious and wanted to tell my aunt, but I was afraid and I didn't want her to. I was worried that maybe in my only semi-conscious state I had made a mistake. Had I imagined it? I knew I hadn't, yet part of me wanted to think that I had. My mom convinced me it would be okay if she told my aunt, so I let her. Now, this came at a time when my uncle had started drinking more heavily, and as it happened, he'd been rather drunk when we had arrived. Thus, my aunt made the decision not even to mention it to him. She figured he was probably too drunk to realize he'd even done it. The rest of the weekend, I was totally uneasy. I had nightmares of my uncle sneaking into the room I was staying in, but fortunately that never happened. Because of this incident, I have been hesitant to visit my aunt and my cousins at all because I don't want to encounter him. I don't want to stay in the same house as him. He creeps me out, and I think I'm legitimately scared of him. My mom and sister managed to convince me to go with them to visit for Thanksgiving. I stayed at my cousin's house while we were there and avoided contact with this uncle as best I could. I constantly wonder and worry if he's done this to either of my cousin's daughters. Also, and I don't know if this adds to this at all, but it says something to me. My nephew, who at the time of the Easter incident was just a few months old, was terrified of him. When we visited during Thanksgiving, he would have just been under 2 years old by then and still didn't care for the man and wouldn't let him pick him up. So, creepy uncle? Let's not meet. This might not be the most harrowing story, but it definitely shook me up and gave me more of a mistrust of strangers. First, I'll give you a little background. I'm female, and growing up I lived in a terraced house in a very small town in the north of England. While it wasn't the nicest part of town, drugs were a problem, and for a short while a pedophile lived on my street, I generally felt quite safe. My mom was, and still is, a worrier, so she always drilled stranger danger into me growing up. This happened when I was around 7 or 8. A school friend had come to my house to play, and we went out on our rollerblades. While we were sat on the pavement outside my house, directly underneath the living room window, strapping on our skates, I noticed a scruffy-looking man walking down my street, holding something in his hand. As I said, it wasn't the nicest of areas, so this wasn't necessarily unusual. I carried on with my skates. As the man reached us, he began to slow, looking right at us. This made me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I just put my head down and carried on. My skates were a nightmare to put on, so many straps. Once he reached about 10 feet away from us, he stopped, not saying anything, just staring. I started getting really scared now, trying to catch my friend's eye for help. My friend hadn't noticed him up to this point, as she had had her back to him. Only when he spoke did I look at his face. I don't remember much about him other than his lips. They were horribly chapped and cracked. I remember that I was surprised he could speak with such sore-looking lips. He mumbled something about chocolate, and held up a crushed-looking Easter egg box. I remember thinking that Easter had been ages ago, so it must have been quite old, and he moved closer towards us. My friend had now noticed him and shuffled along the ground to me, looking a bit scared herself. I shook my head and said, "No thank you," assuming he'd asked a question. I was a polite child, even when scared. He continued to move closer, still mumbling about giving us chocolate, until he was only a few feet from us, towering over us two small children, while we slid backwards, trying to keep away. Luckily, at this point, my dad had seen him through the living room window and popped his head out. He said, "Oi, what are you doing?" The man looked up, surprised, and mumbled, trying to sell chocolate." My dad, who can be intimidating when pissed off, simply told the guy to shove off and that we didn't want any. With that, the man shuffled off, turning his head to stare at us while he did. Safe to say, we didn't play on our rollerblades that day and just stayed indoors instead. Maybe he was just a druggie trying to sell chocolate for drug money, or maybe not. I'll never know. Either way, overdue Easter candy guy, let's not meet. I hadn't thought about this for a while until just now when an animal charity put an alert out on Facebook. So it was April of last year, around Easter, and I had a thought about getting 2 rabbits to accompany my other 2. The 2 I had already were neutered females, so I was looking for neutered males. Rabbit, social hierarchy, lifelong buddies, etc. I was looking on Gumtree for an exercise pen to attach to the one we already had, so that if we did get more bunnies, once bonded, there'd be a bigger space for them when they weren't out during the day. So I found an advert for one, clicked it, and saw that the owner was also putting her rabbits up for adoption. It had been one of those dumb things. Her daughter had been excited for Easter, Mom bought some rabbits didn't want to be picked up, kid made them nervous, eventually becomes bored of them because they're not like toy rabbits. It's an unfortunately common story. Anyway, I call up, ask about the exercise pen and the rabbits, and we arrange to meet the next day when the seller's able to arrange to take that morning off work. The next day, she met me off the train in her town. It was more like a village, really. It was pretty small, and we walked to her house. She was a really nice lady and had a Belfast accent. This is all happening just outside of Glasgow, by the way, and as an English immigrant to Scotland, it was just nice to hear a different accent. On the way, she started telling me about how, after I'd called her, her phone had said she had 15 missed calls. About a minute after we'd arranged to meet, her phone rang again, and a man with a thick Irish traveler accent had started talking about getting rabbits from her without even saying hello. When he'd taken a minute to breathe, she explained that she already had someone coming to see them, and that if that didn't work out, she'd let them know. He sounded angry when she'd said that and swore at her before he hung up on her. Anyway, we get to her house and the exercise pen is exactly what I want, and then I meet the bunnies and fall in love with them. She asks me if I'd like to give them a new home, and I agree. Not just because of how lovely and sociable they were with me within minutes of meeting them, but because they were a bonded pair, and I couldn't stand the thought of them being separated at a shelter. I mean, it was just after Easter, and that time of year and Christmas are the worst times for spaces in shelters. Because I was also taking the rabbits back with me, she was kind enough to drive me back to my flat with everything. Later on that day, around 6 p.m., I get a call from her. When she had dropped me and the rabbits back at my flat, she'd gone straight to work. When she had gotten home, she found her daughter being comforted by the babysitter. She thought she was probably just upset that the rabbits were gone, but no. Her daughter had answered a knock at the door while the babysitter was making dinner. A big guy in scruffy clothes had looked down at her and grinned, and asked her if she had any rabbits. She said she did have, but that they had moved house today, and the guy's smile turned angry. He started shouting at her and pounded his fists at the door, and that's when the babysitter came running. The babysitter said that there was a white transit van parked outside, with 2 other guys inside, and that the man's accent was Irish and distinctively traveler in dialect. Turns out that when she posted the ad for the exercise pen, it had been from her phone, and Gumtree automatically added her street location on the little map next to the username. She had posted a separate ad for the rabbits in the pets for sale section, which I hadn't seen, and that's how they'd found the house. It's a small street in a suburb, so even with a map location, it wasn't a very long street, and they could have easily knocked on the other 5 or 6 doors on the street looking for the bunnies. The babysitter had called the police after she forced the door shut. These guys are apparently always being spotted in small newsagents calling people about dogs for sale. They've been arrested before for organizing dog fights, stealing dogs and rabbits from people's gardens, and the like. It was only when I saw a rehoming charity on Facebook send out an alert about some Irish chaps in a corner shop holding the classifieds open and ringing about a dog near Perth that I remembered. I guess they move around a lot. Perth is quite far from Glasgow. I dread to think what would have happened to my rabbits if I hadn't been looking for a cage that day. It's not the creepiest stories, I suppose, but to know that there are such greedy, heartless people driving around, stealing and buying dogs to fight, and taking rabbits to give the dogs a taste of blood for the fight. Ugh. To the point of shouting at children because they don't have any bait for their dogs, that's just creepy. So, Irish guys looking for my bunnies, let's never meet again. So, I've never been a big believer of ghosts, or maybe it was just a fear of believing, but in the recent months I've been changing my way of living, my faith, my beliefs, my fears, etc. Since I've become more open-minded, something unexplainable happened twice in the past week. I've been living at my apartment since August in downtown Suffolk. They're old buildings that were renovated. I've never had any paranormal experiences here before. I have 4 children, and they have never been scared or had anything unusual happen. On Easter night, I woke up a few times during the night, and while I lay there, dozing back off, I hear jelly beans dropping, bouncing, rolling around on the dining room table where all the kids' Easter baskets are. I only have a 2-bedroom apartment. My son has his own room, and my daughters all share a room. And I set up my own room as sort of a loft or studio apartment, sharing it with the living room, kitchen, and dining room, so I look up to see if the kids are getting into their baskets, but I don't see any of them. So I go check on them in their rooms, but they're all sound asleep. While this is going on, the candies have stopped jumping around and playing. I go back to bed, brushing it off. I wake up another time and I can hear the candy again bouncing and rolling around. Then nothing. And no candy has come out of the baskets. No candy is on the floor or on the table, so I just assume we have a mouse. Fast forward to just a few moments ago. I woke up at like 5:15 and began dozing off again. And here comes the bouncing, rolling candy noise again. So I look over at the table. Nothing. I sit up. No candy noise. I cut on all the lights, and I flip the house upside down looking for candy. Any round candy anywhere, specifically on or around the table. Nothing. I even clean up stray candy wrappers from the floor, but there's no candy anywhere, only in the baskets where it belongs. I look for rodents. I listen. Nothing. I turn my back, walk back to my bed, and sit in it. And then I look over at the table. and there's candy on the floor in front of the dining table with bites taken out of them. I am not kidding. I could never tell my kids because it would terrify them, so here I am, sharing it all on the internet. Needless to say, I'm a believer. I am a very strong believer. But with my recent self-changes, I'm not as terrified as I would have been before. I've told people about Easter night, but everyone brushed it off like there was some simple explanation. I don't really know what happened, but needless to say, I didn't tell my kids, and we had a wonderful Easter anyway. Last Easter, I spent the weekend with my in-laws. We were on a holiday park in the Netherlands, where I live. After arrival, we ate some french fries, played some board games, and then we went to bed. And that's when the paranormal experience started. I think I'd been asleep for about an hour when I woke up and heard my girlfriend talking in her sleep. That was weird, because in the last 2 years we'd been together, I had never heard her talk in her sleep. I went on listening, and she kept repeating the same sentence time after time. It was a weird sentence that I'd never heard her say before, and it was in the Old Dutch language. The sentence was, "Gij zult sterven." You must be dead. I made her wake up, and she said she didn't know anything about the sentence. The next morning we discussed the night before, and it made her scared about the house. I told her there's nothing to be afraid of. Last night, which was our last night in the building, I was awakened again, but not by talking. The door was open, and there was a strange presence in the air. It was strange enough that the door was open because we always sleep with it closed. I looked out into the doorway and saw a dark figure standing there, and I got very cold and had goosebumps everywhere. I was afraid, and so, like a kid, I hid my head under the covers. After a while, I looked again, and it was gone, so I fell back to sleep. The next morning, when I told my girlfriend about it, she said she had to laugh about it because she thought I was dreaming. Have you guys ever had such an experience? I live in Australia, in Victorian countryside, and about 15 minutes away from where I live, there's a small town called Toowoomba. My boyfriend grew up there and knows the area extremely well. Every year, over Easter long weekend, they hold a fishing competition where locals camp in the bush along the Goulburn River. We camped in a different place than they usually do, but to me, it was no different since this was my first year camping with them. It was a nice little open area next to the river and a fair bit away from the other camps. The next closest group of people around was about a 10-minute walk away. We stayed from Thursday night through to Monday morning. Thursday and Friday night were fine. We all stayed around the campfire, drinking and eating and having a great time, fishing during the day. I did hear footsteps from my tent on Friday night early in the morning though, but I can pass that off as one of my friends or an animal in the area. Saturday night I went to bed early, around 11 o'clock p.m., while everyone else stayed up listening to music and drinking around the fire. I was woken up at around 4 a.m. by my boyfriend trying to catch a fox he saw nearby, and was unable to get back to sleep. So I decided to get up and go to the campfire where 3 of my friends, including my boyfriend, remained awake. We sat around for another hour before they decided to go to bed, but I chose to stay up listening to music as I still couldn't sleep. I was incredibly relaxed and enjoying being out there in nature, listening to music from my phone when, at around 5:30 in the morning, just before the sun began to rise, the music was drowned out by the sound of the bush. All I could hear was the wind and the rustling of the trees, and I had an incredibly uneasy feeling wash over me. I heard a leaf crunch right behind me, and I thought somebody had taken a step. My head shot around, but no one was there, yet I didn't feel alone. I stood up with my back to the fire, looking out into the bushland, where slowly but surely what I could only describe as little candle lights flickering through the bush, scattered but almost in formation, started to appear. One by one they popped up, and I had this feeling of sheer terror and dread wash over me. My fear peaked as I ran back to where my friends were, and I hopped in their swag. As soon as I laid down next to them, my fear was completely gone. I woke up a few hours later, around 8:30 a.m., and told a few of my friends about hearing the footsteps and being freaked out. When they questioned why I came running over, I told them the story, and they shrugged it off, not thinking much of it. It wasn't until that night when my boyfriend approached me. He goes, "You saw the lights, didn't you?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't said a single thing to anyone about what I saw regarding the lights, just that I had had an uneasy feeling. "Yes," I replied. "You saw the black magic," he added, smiling. I desperately wanted to know how he knew. Apparently, in the area that we stayed in, people have seen those lights, especially at that time of night. His explanation for it was that there are Aboriginal burial grounds nearby, and they used to have little lights when their loved ones died. Not many have seen it, but I have spoken to a few people since who have heard things about it. I'm not 100% sure on the story behind it, but I know what I saw, and other people have seen the same thing in the area. I don't really want to mess around with Aboriginal magic and all that. I respect them, and I don't want to look too much into the matter. Welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed that short selection of stories. I am working on the next video right now, which will be a rather long Let's Not Meet video. The results of the poll indicated that Let's Not Meet was the favorite for the next video. I will have a poll in the cards for this video too. So I have some options up there of story types that I have the most of. So go ahead and vote on what you want to see next. And yeah, also next week, don't forget that we have the very first creature feature video in which we will be discussing the Irish legend of the Dullahan. So I'm very excited about that. Hopefully you guys will enjoy that as well. And we have one or two more original stories next week as well. I'm also going to start adding some of my horror art to this channel, just so that there's something for you guys to watch, for those of you who would prefer a visual as well. We discussed this in the chat a little bit in the last premiere. Friday nights I have been premiering a longer video. And so yeah, if you want to stop by in the chat for that, because we talk about a lot of things on the channel, and it's a fun time to hang out with you all. But I will be putting some time lapse in the background, so hopefully that's interesting for some of you. So yeah, I think when I do my next original, or the next two originals, I'll put some art in the background so you guys can see something while you're listening. So that's what's coming up on the channel, and I'm pretty excited about it. There's also something really cool happening next week that I will tell you about when it's released, and I will link to it when that happens, so that's exciting. Alright, thank you guys very much for being here, and I can't wait to see you on our next journey into the night.